Good morning, and welcome back to campus for Reunion 2012. I'm Dolly Duffy, a 1984 grad and the Executive Director of your Alumni Association. This is the first of two weekend events of our Notre Dame Perspective series, and it really is a focus on our commitment on your behalf to lifelong learning and an opportunity to bring together some of our distinguished faculty, alumni experts, to discuss the really critical issues of our time. So this is the first of two, one today, another one similarly tomorrow that will be held over in DeBartolo Performing Arts Center. We're really thrilled to partner with Arts and Letters for this one, and to bring today's program. We want to give a special thanks to Dean John McGreevy and Marie Blakey for all of their hard work to put this together. Thank you. And this morning we have a panel of experts here to talk about the value of the arts. In a world that's really riven by economic crisis and overwhelmed by unending amounts of information, the arts have really remained a critical part of our ability to understand society. And so we're delighted to have this great group together to talk about the importance, the direction, and how they see it fitting in today's world. Our moderator for this panel isn't just an expert, he's also an alum, and it's his 20th reunion, Chris Murphy. Chris is a 1992 graduate, and he's back here with a lot of his classmates for his 20th reunion. He's the co-owner, the artistic director, and chief operating officer for Catharsis Productions. Doesn't it just make you feel good even to hear that word, Catharsis Productions? It's a company that produces innovative programming aimed at reducing interpersonal violence. Please join me in welcoming Chris Murphy to kick off this program.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Value of Art discussion. I am honored to introduce each of our distinguished panelists before inviting them to share in their own words and work how the value of art can inspire, enrich, and empower humankind. Following their addresses, we will open the session up to questions from you. I'd like to begin by introducing Maria Tomasula. She is a Michael P. Grace Professor of Art in the Department of Art, Art History, and Design. Professor Tomasula received her BFA from the University of Illinois at Chicago and her MFA from Northwestern University. A member of the Notre Dame faculty since 1994, Professor Tomasula teaches both painting and drawing and is a 2011 recipient of the Edmund P. Joyce Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching. Her paintings recall the work of the 18th and early 19th century Spanish Baroque religious painters and Mexican votive paintings and depict familiar objects in highly stylized symbolic compositions. She was commissioned to create a new version of Our Lady of Guadalupe for the Notre Dame Basilica of the Sacred Heart, and her painting was installed on December 12, 2008. An active member of the art scene in Chicago, her work has been written about in publications such as the New York Times, the New Yorker, Art News, and Chicago Tribune, and her paintings have been exhibited in many venues and galleries around the country. Keith Davis is the director of the Digital Visual Theater and a concurrent assistant professional specialist in the Department of Physics. Professor Davis received his BS in Applied Mathematics from the University of Tulsa and his MS and PhD in Physics from Clemson University. As director of the Digital Visualization Theater, or DVT, a 50-foot hemispherical digital theater and planetarium, he develops lectures with faculty, often creating entirely new visual content to explain astronomical, biological, chemical, or philosophical topics. He also has advised the creation of artistic works in the DVT, twice playing the DVT as a visual instrument to accompany live musical performance. Professor Davis. Oops. James Collins is a professor and department chair in the Department of Film, Television, and Theater, and a concurrent professor in the Department of English. Professor Collins received his bachelor's and doctoral degrees from the University of Iowa. A member of the Notre Dame faculty since 1985, he specializes in film and television theater, theory, film history, popular culture, and postmodernism, and he teaches courses in these areas as well as digital culture. Collins is the recipient of the College of Arts and Letters 2010 Sheedy Excellence in Teaching Award, which acknowledges a faculty member who has sustained excellence in research and instruction over a wide range of courses. In the summers, he also teaches his fellow faculty members from the College of Arts and Letters in a seminar designed to help faculty from each department better incorporate film in their classroom. Entitled How to Teach Film and Screen Culture Across the Humanities, the seminar has evolved to include a wide range of media formats, from traditional cinema to YouTube. He is the author of several books, his most recent being Bring on the Books for Everybody, How Literary Culture Became Popular Culture. Professor Collins. Terrence McDonald is a Kellogg Assistant Professor of Sociology in the Department of Sociology and a faculty fellow with the Kellogg Institute of International Studies. Professor McDonald received his BA from the University of Virginia and his PhD from Northwestern University. A cultural sociologist, he joined the Notre Dame faculty in 2011. His research interests include culture in media, health and AIDS, social movements, gender and sexuality, urban studies, and sociological theories and methods. Understanding people's creativity is at the core of his work, and he studies the role of objects and media in everyday life. His recent research helps explain why HIV and AIDS media campaigns often fail to change people's beliefs and behavior in response to this disease. His work has been published in several sociology journals and quarterlies. Professor McDonald. I would like to now invite Professor Tomasula to join us at the podium.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Chris, for the intro. So as a way to get at the subject this morning, what I'd like to do is look at some works of contemporary art and talk about what that art does, how it functions in our cultural moment. But before doing that, let's first look at two images, neither of them contemporary art, to start with. Just to remind ourselves of how different cultural conditions give rise to distinct ideas and how those ideas can be embodied in perceptible form. Okay, so here we're looking at The Great Chain of Being, an image from 1579 that visually describes the ordered structure of all matter and life as understood by people in 16th century Christian Europe. Beginning at the lower earthly realm, we see metals and stones. Then higher are plants, animals, orders of men, orders of angels, and then God at the very top. This single image visually condenses ideas that evolved over a long history and describes the fixed relationship of all categories within creation by using the visual metaphor of a hierarchy, with purer forms ranked higher up on this scale. Humans, represented here as being both flesh and spirit, straddle the physical realm of matter below humans and the spiritual realm above humans, and that, it was thought, is the source of our moral struggles between animal appetite and divine reason. This image also describes a radical discontinuity between the distinct categories depicted where, for example, humans are an order of creation separate from soulless animals and completely unconnected to plants. So this image is both a visual distillation of a broad set of ideas that have to do with order and creation, as well as a sort of vector that transmits those ideas to viewers. Here's another image, the Hillis plot Tree of Life created in 2000. This cladogram also orders the relationship of living things to each other, but these relationships are based on an analysis of rRNA sequences. Just as in the previous image, this is a distillation of an immense amount of information that's effectively communicated through the use of a visual metaphor, in this case, the circle. Here we see no radical discontinuity between categories. Rather, life forms are shown to exist on a continuum. The lines that radiate out of the central axis represent time, with the oldest forms shown closer to the center, originating millions of years ago. This image stresses deep, not shallow time, relatedness, not discontinuity, and constant change rather than a fixed order. So I wanted to begin with these two images, both to underline some of the ways content is communicated through visual form, as well as to emphasize how images in general, and I think art in particular, might be seen as a kind of tangible point of convergence where what's known at any given place and time can effectively be distilled into an image, an object, an event, or into some other form that's intelligible to the culture that produced it. The several works of contemporary art I'm going to talk about were made under the set of conditions that we, in the post-industrial West, live in, and that have emerged from the networks of knowledge of our culture, the same culture that produced this cladogram. So this is a self-portrait, appropriately titled Self, by British artist Mark Quinn from 1991. In some ways, this sculpture looks pretty familiar in that it appears to be part of the long tradition of portrait busts that are meant to resemble the person represented. But here, rather than use carved stone or cast bronze, Quinn uses his own blood, 4.5 liters of it, molded in the form of his face and frozen within a refrigeration unit. So what's he up to here? Well, after you get past the, ew reaction that most people have, I think this sculpture has a lot of interesting things to say about our cultural moment. And it says it through the methods, materials, and form of its making. One of the ongoing shifts that's accelerated over the course of our lifetimes is the change in our ideas of how we as individuals come to be constituted. And much of this change has been prompted by the wide dissemination of scientific knowledge. There's been a stream of research results that the public steadily consumes, much of it focused on the biology of our bodies and the extent to which we're determined by our physical selves. How many of us have gone from thinking that a physical disease that occurs among family members may be genetically based to thinking that a behavioral disease like alcoholism may be inherited, to thinking that a temperament like being emotionally volatile is genetically determined, or that a propensity like lying is materially based. We increasingly understand ourselves, our medical histories, and even our temperaments and behaviors as tied to our genes, the material of our bodies. Quinn gives concrete form to this sense, to that shift that's taken place. I was born into a very traditional setting where early on I absorbed the belief that I possessed my body, that somehow my essential self existed somewhere, like my soul or my mind. But I now live in a world where I am my body. Myself, my mind, all arise and can only arise from the physical processes of my material existence. We are, this sculpture asserts, our material selves, period. This is a live creature named Alba, the GPF bunny from 2000. GPF means green fluorescent protein. Alba is a genetically engineered hybrid rabbit jellyfish that glows green. She was made by Eduardo Katz, who lives in Chicago, in collaboration with a team of scientists in France, who injected the bunny as an embryo with DNA from a phosphorescent jellyfish. When Alba was put on public display, it caused an absolute uproar, with Katz and his rabbit appearing on newscasts all over the world. Alba seemed to raise deep-seated fears about crossing species boundaries. The irony is that by the time Alba was created, all the laboratory techniques employed to make her had been in common use for at least a decade and had already created untold numbers of biologically engineered animals for medical research, for use in industrial farming, in pharmaceutical production, and so on. A lot of the people who were disturbed by the biotech future that Alba seemed to portend didn't realize that they were already living in that world. And that's at least partly because the activities conducted in research labs are usually not intended for public consumption, whereas art is made precisely to be seen by as wide a public as possible. This is the Edunia, created from 2003 to 2008 by Eduardo Katz again, this time with Aptec Laboratory Services. The Edunia is a transgenic plantimal hybrid created by isolating and sequencing a gene from Katz's blood that's now expressed in the red veins of the flower. Given that this work was also made using, by now, pretty conventional lab techniques, we might ask whether we regard all of this as a reflection on the relatedness of life among different species, or as something illicit. Last week, in the online version of the New York Times, there was a video ad celebrating the field of synthetic biology, which sees DNA as the raw material in the creation of new organisms, and nature as a, quote, manufacturing platform. The Edunia may seem startling, but maybe not so much when you consider that over the last 10 years, 3,000 patents have been issued for genetically engineered organisms. That 2 years ago, the first computer-designed organism was introduced, and that in 2011, China announced that they've created transgenic dairy cows, 300 of them, that produce milk with the same properties as human breast milk. So we live in a world that's adapting to a new set of realities, some of which have been brought about by new technologies. When contemporary art employs those capabilities, it's not to produce something practically usable, like the transgenic goats that make pharmaceutical drugs in their udders, but rather as a prompt to thinking about our world, to making present and visible what is often dispersed and hidden. We live in the aftermath of the Human Genome Project, and as a direct response to it, photographer Gary Schneider began working with geneticists at the cytogenetics lab at Columbia University to make genetic self-portraits based on his biological specimens, resulting in photos of his retinas, hair, intestinal flora, and so on. He, like others, began to consider the ramifications of not only the fact that we've increasingly become our biology, but also that our biology can be rendered as information streams, rearrangeable bits of data like pixels in a digital scan. This is a sculpture by Marilyn Oliver called Family Portrait, which consists of images based on MRI, PET, and CT scans. This work represents family members whose flesh has been rendered into data. It portrays the disquieting transformation of people into dematerialized specters, individuals that are present, but only as information. The idea that a person could be represented, and maybe even represented better and more fully by their biological information rather than by mere facial features, isn't that unusual? This is an image of sequenced DNA with the bases color-coded. And here's a screenshot from the DNA 11 website, where anyone can have a custom DNA portrait created by sending in a cheek swab, starting for as little as $1.99. So some contemporary art is made using new technologies to make visible not only the capacities of those technologies, but also the social and other changes they engender. There are also artists who try to reflect on some aspect of living in the contemporary world that use more traditional materials and methods, and my own paintings fit into that category. And so to end, I'll show you a couple of my own pictures. We're living through not only a biotech revolution, but also a cognitive revolution, where solving the mystery of consciousness looks more and more inevitable, while the idea that each of us are autonomous individuals is more and more challenged. The familiar sensation of feeling myself to be singular, of having had some vital part in generating who I am, is so at odds with another sense of self, the one that understands myself as having emerged from the shifting interplay of a number of forces. The millions of years of biological evolution that determined the limits and capacities of my body, including its cognitive machinery, the thousands of years of cultural developments that resulted in the familiar kinship ties, institutions, and traditions that gives order to my life, the hundreds of years of an identity-forming family history, and the dozens of years of education that have resulted in a particular historically determined worldview. These two are very different ideas of how we come to be constituted as individuals. And what I try to do in my pictures is to symbolically enact, in visual form, that complicated sensation of being, a feeling that, for me, centers on a persistent sensation of singularity that is simultaneously qualified, even countered, by the knowledge that I'm the product of forces over which I have no control. And I try to do this through aesthetic form. In painting, brushstrokes are generally read as having an emotive trace. So I developed a way of painting that completely eliminates any visible brushstrokes, any vestige of my hand, by using a methodical, dispassionate process of layered blending and stippling that results in an uninflected surface that looks like it could have been made by reproducible mechanical means. However, the image that emerges from that calculated process is totally centered on the notion of subjectivity, with every element in the picture chosen for its expressive value and its power to engage a viewer emotionally. So there are lots of different kinds of art that engage with a huge spectrum of ideas. What I've tried to do here is to focus on a few selected works that deal in very different ways with one aspect of contemporary existence, how science is changing our sense of ourselves. One of the reasons I, like others, value art is because it can act as a point of cultural convergence through the ways it gives tangible form to the often abstract and disperse ideas and practices that shape our lives. And with that, I thank you and send it over to Keith Davis.
Good morning, everyone. I am sort of the token scientist on the board today, which means that I don't have anywhere near as much experience with art as my fellow panelists. But what I do have is a growing appreciation for it, as I've learned by both working at the Digital Visualization Theory and Theater and working with artists, and also by learning to spend a lot more of my own time exploring artwork. And what I want to do today is just share with you a few thoughts that I've picked up from the perspective of being a scientist and yet working with artists, beginning to explore an understanding of art from my own perspective. But the way I'm really going to do that is by starting by talking about science, not starting by talking about art. Science, I think, is inherently an attempt to explore, explain, and understand the world. This is very distinct, by the way, from engineering and technology, which I think in many ways is an attempt to control the world as a result of having figured out how it works, which is the part that science does. So let's keep science and engineering and technology a little separate. I think sometimes they get muddled in our minds. In order to try to explain the world, science has found that it has to do a certain set of things, and one of those sets of things is to control the environment. We've developed a very rigorous scientific method and a series of very rigorous statistical techniques used to make sure that we can take what we first see as maybe a little glimmer of correlation, the connection between two things, A happens and B also happens, which is really miles away from causation, which is what we're actually trying to get to in science. A happens, and therefore B must happen. Those are very different things, and we use a series of controlled environments in order to get at that. That means that science is inherently limited in a way that we often don't think about. Scientists think about this a lot, but I think the public often doesn't think about the limited set of questions that science can discover. We really can only look into the things that lend themselves in some way to our control. We have to eliminate all the variables that we want to avoid looking at the moment with our series of controls, and then we bring in the one variable, hopefully one variable that we're trying to change. The reason we do this is almost embarrassing to admit. There is an old quote from a scientist that says, "We like to think of the universe as simple and comprehensible, but the universe is under no obligation to live up to our expectations." The sort of embarrassing secret behind that quote is the reason we say we like to think of it as simple and comprehensible. We don't have a choice. I think that the reason that scientists are always trying to make things as simple as possible is because that's all we can get at in a lot of ways. And if you think back to that series of controls, we're trying to eliminate all the complicating factors, keep it simple, look at just one thing. Otherwise, we really never really know whether or not we've gotten to that causative relationship that we're trying to get at. So again, this limits what we can do. As I have continued to learn about art and the artistic process and the creative process, both by advising artistic work, really more technically, because I'm handling the technical aspects of the DVT, the Digital Visualization Theater, I've learned that, or I've come to think that art is this incredibly brave attempt to soldier on towards understanding without rigor. So in science, we have this very rigorous process, but that limits the questions we can address. Art really seems to want to address everything in as much as it can. And so I think it just says, forget all this rigor stuff. I don't care if we don't really fully know the answer. We're still going to try. We're still going to fight for that attempt at understanding things, whether by expressing it, seeing how that attempted expression affects us, passing it on to the next artist down the line who's going to pick up that expression and move it into another place. And I really think that that's a big part of what I think of the value of art as being, is it has this freedom that science doesn't have to try to interact with these issues that we can't get at in any real scientific way. Now, that obviously limits the questions that art can address. For instance, we don't want artists designing our new antibiotics. But I think that it's important to think of art and science almost as siblings in a way sometimes, where art is getting at the things that science can't get at, science is getting at the things that art can't get at. And it's really up to all of us to try to use both and try to sort of fill our own experience with both so that we can have an understanding of what the world really is. Or maybe not what it really is, but what we're actually trying to get at in the world. So let me give just an imaginary example. If we were to take an experience such as the Iraq War and create a movie about it, what we're really doing is expressing something about the intersection of war and us. At least that's the way that I see it. That can be therapeutic, it can be political, it can be entertaining, it can really be a host of quite a few things. But I think it's the function of expressing something without needing anyone, even the creator of the artwork itself, to completely fully understand what they're trying to express. That's really brilliant, and that's really the place where I've watched artists as they've struggled with that creative process and have started on something with a medium and then found out that that medium didn't work or it wasn't getting at what was in their head, and then they move to another medium or they maybe adjust their technique, and eventually at the end of it they come up with something that they're satisfied at least tries to get at, or maybe even completely gets at what they've actually tried to express, because people have different artists have different methods that have different levels of sort of control over what they're trying to express. So that function of expressing something without needing even the creator of the work to understand it is the exploratory part of art that I think is really, really valuable. And in some ways, again, that exploration aspect makes it similar to science in a lot of ways. So I do have a few images to show you. These are not taken from artwork. These are actually taken from my dissertation project, where I was studying the interaction of an explosion of a star with a cloud of gas that could become the solar system. So I was exploring the origins of the solar system. And I want to show you some of the visual exploration I do in a scientific work that I think parallels in some way the visual exploration that artists do in the visual arts anyway. And sorry, I keep referring to art, and I'm often mostly talking about the visual arts because I'm an incredibly visual person, and that's most of what my experience is with. So this is, can we dim the lights just a touch, because that's going to be pretty hard to see. Well, maybe you can see it. So this is a series of numbers. What I do is I do computational hydrodynamic simulations, which means that I start with a computer program that has the equations of physics programmed into it, and then sort of set up a set of initial conditions and let my simulated nature take its course. This is the result of a collision of an explosion with a molecular cloud supposedly sitting out in space. What you're seeing, though, is a series of numbers that I can represent in several different ways. Here is the exact same set of numbers represented in a different way. And to me, there's some parallel that I don't want to overstate, but there is some parallel in my attempt to understand what's in the numbers and art's attempt to understand what's in the world when it tries to represent things in multiple different ways. And I just thought this was an interesting parallel that I wanted to share with you. Here's another set of numbers. These are really, the different colors here simply represent where various materials started out. And so the red, the green, and the blue, really, I don't want to go too much into the science of what you're actually seeing there, but just think of that as yet another series of numbers, this time represented with color. Exact same series of numbers represented in a completely different way. And again, this is me doing, for scientific reasons, what I think that artists try to get at when they create something that reflects the world around them. We can imagine that the world is the numbers behind this, and I'm trying to reflect what those numbers are. And the reason I'm doing this is because my computer can't look at billions of numbers and tell me what they mean, and I can't go through billions of numbers one by one and tell you what they mean. I have to turn it into some kind of an image. This is an end point of all of that with a lot of different other numbers layered on top of it. I don't know that I really have anything particular to say about this, but I wanted to put this together as more of a polished image. Those others weren't particularly polished. They were just my exploratory system, but this has a lot of scientific information so that if you're trained and you've read the 200 pages I wrote about all of this, you would be able to read those numbers and understand what they're trying to tell you. But we'll move on from that. The next thing I want to show you actually is, first I want to talk a little about what I think of as the contemplative nature of art and talk about how that relates to the contemplative nature of science. One of the things that science does is it observes. It looks around at the rest of the world, and as a scientist, you spend a lot of time simply trying to interact with the world, watch it, think about it, see if there's a way to internalize it so that you can then express it back out in, say, a series of equations or a set of conclusions. And an example of that is waves. The wave equations are actually fairly simple. I learned to solve them when I was in undergraduate. Doing my undergraduate work, I can write them down. They're short, they're simple, they're easy to work with. They can be complex depending on what you're studying, but I have, over the years, developed a series of almost a mental vocabulary to think about waves. It starts with those set of equations, and it moves to the various different solutions that I know. For one-dimensional waves that are like a wave going down a string, for two-dimensional waves like a wave on a drum head, or even three-dimensional waves, which is really hard to visualize, in, say, for instance, in the core of a supernova explosion. The waves there are very important. So I've got a series of visual vocabulary in my mind. But when I was looking into what I was going to say for today's presentation, I found myself looking at artists online, and I found Ruben Margolin does a series of kinetic artwork, so artwork that moves, it's sculpture that moves, and he studies a lot of waves. And I found myself looking at these different representations of moving physical waves and thinking about waves in a completely new way. And I think that that's another very important value that art has, is that it brings us a moment to stop what we're doing, look at the artistic piece, or read the work, watch the play, and think about, for a moment, without trying to control it or interact with it, just think about the particular issue. So I have a clip that I'd like to play now. It's just a 45-second. There's no sound. That is an example of the so here's the mechanism that drives the wave. So this is just an example of one of his moving waves. And as I found myself completely enwrapped in these series of moving artworks that I just found, I really started to think about, are there new ways that I can think about waves based on what I'm seeing here? And what did he have to do in order to construct the wave? That was an interesting experience as well, which is why I selected this one, because it starts with that driving motive. All right, that's a series of my thoughts on the interaction between science and artwork, and the way that, as a scientist, I have learned to really and truly value art, and to take some time to learn a lot about it and to value the artists that I work with. So thank you.
Hi, my name is Jim Collins, and I'm delighted to be here this morning. Well, since we're all reflecting on the value of art today from our various disciplines, and I teach film, so I thought I'd choose a scene that epitomizes what this particular art form can accomplish. One of the courses I teach here at Notre Dame is an intensive seminar for Notre Dame faculty who want to incorporate films in their classes, but could use some help figuring out the most productive ways to do that. I start the seminar by telling them that the most important thing they need to know about film is that it won't add very much to their pedagogy if they use it only as a sidecar illustration. The most rewarding way to use film is to start by thinking about it as a way of knowing, a highly effective way of constructing knowledge that we can use to understand our existence. Okay, so what can film teach us about the world that we can't otherwise get from CNN or a sociological study or political theory? The scene I'll be showing you today is from a film called Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, an adaptation of the novel by Jonathan Safran Foer that was published in 2005. I'll try to contextualize this scene as quickly as I can, but it's a bit complicated, so you'll have to bear with me. The boy that you'll be seeing in this scene is the main character, Oscar Schell. His father died in the World Trade Center on 9/11, and the film focuses on his attempt to come to terms with his death. When Oscar is going through his father's effects, he finds a vase that holds a key inside a small envelope, and the name Black is written on the back of that envelope. He has no idea who or what Black means, or what the key is intended for, so he decides to talk to everyone named Black listed in the New York City phone book, all 472 of them, if need be, hoping that they'll be able to tell him something meaningful about his father and what the key might signify. He pursues this very ambitious project by traveling all over the 5 boroughs, trying to find the person who might solve the mystery, undaunted by the scope of this project because he knows as long as he searches, it will keep him closer to his father. But as he searches, we learn something else. Oscar is haunted by the 6 messages his father left on the home answering machine when he called home from the World Trade Center that morning. At one point, Oscar plays back the first five of these increasingly frantic messages for his grandfather, but his grandfather stops Oscar before he gets to the 6th message, telling him he can't bear to hear anymore, and there's no point in listening to them anyway. In the scene I'm about to show you, Oscar finally meets the Mr. Black, who can tell him about the vase and the key inside. It turns out that this Mr. Black sold the vase to Oscar's father in an estate sale that he'd held to dispose of his own father's effects, and that he had no idea there was a key inside, but that he looked for it for months because it was the key to a safety deposit box. Oscar's search appears to have been a miserable failure. He gives Mr. Black the key he's been searching for, but Oscar comes away with nothing. This man had only met his father briefly, and all he can tell Oscar is that he seemed like a good man. But then just as he leaves this total stranger, who had had only the briefest contact with his father, Oscar's story takes an unexpected turn. Here, in less than 4 minutes, we see the difference between art and reportage. We see the television screen with the images that were repeated endlessly on the news media that day and for weeks afterward, and have remained vestiges of our national trauma. But director Stephen Daldry shows us what CNN can't show us, as he visualizes the impact of those images on the victims of 9/11 and the way they tried to put their shattered lives back together again. He shows us an extreme close-up of the terrified face of the child. But through a skillful use of the point-of-view shots, we see the ringing telephone and then the answering machine through Oscar's eyes. We feel his panic as he relives his private trauma. The shot where we see Oscar's face turn away from the answering machine that suddenly goes dead to look over at the television screen at the very moment the tower falls is stunningly brilliant. Because we've all seen the television image time and time again, but we've never seen it as this boy does now, and at that moment our understanding of 9/11 changes forever. Now, I have to admit that I avoided reading Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close for several years after it was published, even though I think Safran Foer is an outstanding novelist. I didn't see the point of going back over the events that I thought I was already too familiar with. And after all, what could this novel, and then this film adaptation, tell us what we didn't already know? But art gives a different kind of knowledge than reportage, because it tells us about impact and memory, and finally something quite essential about forgiveness. The real genius of this scene isn't just putting us inside Oscar's head and letting us see the images that he keeps playing back endlessly in his memory. The film also makes us empathize with Mr. Black, the total stranger who, like the viewer, has no connection to this boy, but suddenly has to witness his private trauma and hear his confession, whether he wants to or not, and then is asked to forgive him. Like Mr. Black, we don't really want to hear this, and when we do, we empathize with Mr. Black as well as Oscar. What would we say if we were there next to Oscar and he asked for our forgiveness? The film makes us share Mr. Black's discomfort, but then it also shows us the result of his compassion. The artistry of the film is not just how it depicts the impact of 9/11 on the families of those who died in the towers, but how it pulls us into the grieving process, making us relive those events as it transforms us from viewers into witnesses. Film is a visual medium, but it envisions both the visible and the invisible. And in so doing, it performs one of the principal functions of great art, to provide a way of knowing about the world that is infinitely more sophisticated than any other form of knowledge, because it can depict the event and the way it resonates. Show us the photographic record that we may have seen ourselves on the news, but also evoke all the things we can't see, which nevertheless shape our memories and determine our actions in the future. Thank you.
I'm going to have to find a way to forgive Jim for giving me an audience of weeping. But Jim, thanks so much. That was a point well made, I've got to say. Okay, so where am I? Here we go. Yay. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about a project I've done recently on cultural organizations in crisis. And actually, can I have the lights up a little bit now so I can actually see people? Thanks. Great. Okay. So I wanted to start by asking how many of you in the room here, and I'm getting the light here, have been to the opera in the last year? Okay. And how many people have been to the ballet? Okay. You guys might be the last people who are going to those things. If you look at the numbers, it's looking pretty dim for many of the high arts. You can see along the left-hand side the actual percentage of Americans who are going to those kinds of artistic forum, and then also the the change over time from 1982 to essentially the present, and you can see some pretty dramatic numbers there. You pay attention to opera and ballet, which I just cherry-picked. You have very few numbers of people already seeing them, and then especially with opera, a 30% decline, or ballet, a 31% decline. But then you also see over here literature, craft festivals, and parks and historic buildings on the right-hand side generally have more people, more Americans participating in them. But if you think about the 37% decline, that's a large number of people who are declining in that amount of time in participating in craft festivals. Okay. So along with this drop in attendance, oh my gosh, my image is gone? That's too bad. Okay, well you had pictures of all these places. That's what you're missing. Yeah. Oh, they come up. Oh, you animated them. Whoa. I've never been able to do that before. This is the coolest. They're not popping up in order, but that's okay. It doesn't matter. You get the idea, right? That a number of these organizations have closed their doors, and for that matter, major organizations like the Philadelphia Orchestra went bankrupt last year, and the New York City Opera is in financial trouble such that they can no longer perform in the Lincoln Center, which has been their home since essentially the beginning. Clicking through those so you see all of those. Great, okay. So my colleague Stephen Tepper, who's at Vanderbilt, and I wanted to understand how arts communities were justifying the continued existence of these organizations that are in crisis. What arguments do people make when trying to save the local opera house, museum, or theater? And in addition, we wanted to see whether people's defense for the arts was related to discussions with the world of cultural policy, which is trying to promote arts. Okay, got my remote. So, this decline in attendance may in part be a story of inflexible policy models. So Bill Ivey, who is the former chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts under Bill Clinton, has argued that our policy model is 40 years old. Our primary partnering strategy of matching grants to nonprofits has matured, and for the past 10 years, our nonprofit refined arts have presented striking indicators of an overbuilt industry, depressed wages, lack of capital, defensive conservative business practices. To paraphrase a tune from Oklahoma, we've gone about as far as we can go. It's pretty dramatic for a former chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts to make those kinds of claims. Our current chairman makes it even more starkly. He says, and sorry the quote's not up there, but he says, you can either increase demand or decrease supply. Demand is not going to increase, so it's time to think about decreasing supply. Okay. Historically, there have been two strains of argument made about why we should try to protect and save these high art organizations. First, there's an elite argument that says high arts are the best. They're the most important culture that we have. But such arguments also tend to have an air of exclusivity. You need specialized knowledge to understand these arts, money to afford tickets, and when viewed from this light, the high arts are about maintaining the status of high art and oftentimes the people who enjoy them. Second, there's been a more populist or democratic argument that motivated much of the cultural policy over the last half century, claiming that the arts are good for everyone. They should be made more accessible. So we have ballets and theaters appearing outside the major cultural hubs of New York, Chicago, and LA, and migrating out to smaller cities throughout the country, supported in large part by government funding and private foundations that seek to kind of create a more richly educated population, which they argue is good for democracy. So the question remains, when people defend these high art organizations that are in crisis, that are about to go under, that are filing for bankruptcy, do they make an elitist or populist argument? So to study this, what we did was we sampled across cases of arts and cultural organizations under threat of closure from across the arts field, not just the high art, nonprofit arts in the upper left, which is what the NEA tends to pay attention to, the symphonies, ballets, art museums, dramatic theaters. But we also looked at high art for-profit organizations like jazz clubs, art house cinemas, galleries, Broadway theaters. Also, nonprofit and popular culture organizations like libraries, parades, indie public radio, festivals, aquariums, and the like, and also in the for-profit popular culture quadrant of drive-in movie theaters, bookstores, fairgrounds, record stores, comic book stores, etc. Okay. And then what we did was we took newspaper articles about these organizations under crisis, and we analyzed them for the kinds of language people are using to talk about why we should keep these things around. And what we found was that people still fall back on elitist arguments despite all these attempts to be more democratic in cultural policy. This is what we call a wordle. It's kind of a handy way of displaying this data. It's not actually how we analyzed it, but what we do is we take all the text of the newspaper articles and it pulls out the most important words, the words that appear again and again and again. And in circles here, you get things like jewels, crowns, treasure, gems, all things associated with royalty and eliteness. When you look at how people are talking about these in the newspapers, they make claims like the Philadelphia Orchestra is a treasure, the solid gold Cadillac of orchestras, and a cultural jewel. Ballet, Florida is one of the jewels of the city. The Rose Museum at Brandeis is called a gem of a museum and a crown jewel and the jewel of Brandeis. As you can sense, crowns evoke royalty, Cadillacs suggest wealth, and so without fail, the discourse around each of our cases of high culture nonprofit institutions privilege these images of wealth, status, and cultural excellence. These organizations were talked about also as symbols of their cities, but in some ways they're thinking about them as symbols of cities, but rather working for their communities. They're not thinking about them working for their communities. This is about what they represent as a city to outsiders rather than what they're doing for internal people who actually live there. And this is very different from how people from these other quadrants have talked about why they should save their particular artistic organization. So I'm going to move quickly through these other ones because we're short on time. But here are wordles from the other quadrants. Here's the high culture nonprofit quadrant, and what you can see from the things I've circled here is that there's a sense of an authentic religious experience that you have when going to see some of these things. So you have discussion of dirt and place and things being authentic or offbeat. The kind of experience or atmosphere you get is smoky, right? But also things like chapel and soul and magic and religion, right? So this notion that when we go there, you have a transformative experience. For the pop culture nonprofit, you get a different kind of discourse about civic life. And community comes very strongly to the fore, if you can see that. Notions of what's doing for the city, whether it's democratic, the public good, voters, this notion that libraries and festivals are doing things for that community in powerful ways. And then finally, popular culture commercial organizations are oftentimes talked about as a destination, a place with a history and a tradition. But what's interesting is you can see there aren't as many things popping to the fore in big letters, which suggests that they're the most important things that appeared. In some ways, because this was not as clearly delineated what kind of arguments people were making. People drew from a lot of different areas, including things like jewels and gems, you can see up there that it didn't circle. But okay, what's interesting then, if you think about through these articles, they often talked about community organizations rising up to try to support these organizations. And it's in this quadrant where you see most of the community organizations popping up, and the least number of community organizations pop up when it comes to the high art nonprofit organization. So there's something interesting going on here in how people are making arguments for why things should be saved. Okay. So to stay economically viable, because they're so dependent on support from many of these government and private foundation funds, many of these high art nonprofit organizations have worked to conform to these democratic-oriented policies. They make themselves more accessible through museum free days and the like, and also try to create education departments as kind of a way to outreach to the broader public. But if you look at the way in which people still talk about why these organizations should exist, it's not for those broader publics, but instead it's for kind of a broader elite agenda. So even if they are more accessible, people don't attend to these arts because I don't think they're really getting something out of these organizations. So instead, we might want to think about how you might change the focus to one that supports arts that actually help people in kind of building social goods, the public needs that can be met by different kinds of arts. So research on the arts suggests that engagement with art increases people's creativity and innovation. There's a lot of public discussion about this too, with Richard Florida's work on creative cities, right, or Daniel Pink's work on creativity. That's a lot in the public press right now. It also does a lot of work in kind of creating communities of people who come together to enjoy a particular kind of art or to make art together. And as we've seen so powerfully from the other presenters, it also gives us new ways of thinking about the world, right? There's a value in being able to see the world in a variety of different ways, and art has the capacity to be able to do that. But research also suggests that this happens more often when people are actually making art rather than just simply consuming the art. So maybe I should have asked you a different question as we opened. Rather than asking you how many had attended a ballet or an opera, I should have maybe said, how many of you have sung an aria recently? How many of you have painted a painting? How many of you have danced the Nutcracker? Or maybe something else, right? So not just thinking about high arts, but other arts can do this, right? So making a short film for YouTube with your family, right? That's something you could do that's also creative and doing these kinds of things of community building that aren't necessarily committed or connected to these high art nonprofit institutions. So as a thought experiment, I want to conclude with a radical proposal. It's a wildly different view of cultural policy. Now, I'm not saying this is what I believe. I'm saying if we thought about things differently, this might give us new avenues, new paths to take in trying to improve our cultural life. Historically, cultural policy has viewed culture as both fragile and elite, with the goals of preserving and defending the best of the best kinds of art for a talented few and their patrons. What if we viewed arts as robust and egalitarian instead of as fragile and elite? In this view, we see that people are always going to make art. People are innately creative. They want to be doing this kind of work. And so there's less focus on preservation. Instead, it seeks to support art making by a wide range of people, not just the talented few. And such a cultural policy would focus more on the kinds and quality of engagement with the arts rather than simply focusing on attendance, which is the NEA's main measure of whether things are working, right? As that first table I showed you was attendance at opera performances. So this model looks a little differently. I'm just going to read what I have here, and hopefully this will provoke some discussions for the Q&A. So such a model might privilege amateurs rather than professionals. It might privilege arts that encourage innovation rather than preservation. It might support arts that engage in idea exchange and flow, not in controlling meaning for the public about what art means. That might encourage controversial moments rather than defending art from controversy. Encourage appropriation, not just creation. Productive consumption, not passive attendance. Engagement, not just attendance. Omnivorous promiscuity, not connoisseurship. That means kind of enjoying lots of different kinds of art as opposed to just being an opera fan. And also this notion of democracy, not taste, right? That anyone can participate, not just people with a particular kind of taste. So I'd like to end there, but hopefully that gives you a new way of thinking about how we might go forward with cultural policy that might encourage some of these social effects of art along the way. Thank you so much. Are we just going?
Okay, does everybody feel smarter now? I feel like I should have gotten a college credit for that. That was incredible. Let's give a big round of applause to our panelists again. Maybe I just got a master's, I'm not sure. At any rate, we have about 15 to 20 minutes left for questions. I had a couple of questions myself, but before I get into that, I know Professor Collins only has a few minutes with us before he needs to go off and teach a class. So if there are any pressing questions that anyone has, there are microphones at the front of right in front of the stage. I invite you to come forward. If you need one of us to bring a microphone to you, we'd be happy to do that as well, or I'd be happy to repeat one. So I will give you a couple of seconds for anyone to come forward if they'd like. Sure.
I want to thank everyone for this presentation, but one of the things that I've learned with the gentleman that showed the movie clip and a lot of art is the power of story. I think art is in many ways telling a story, where you even put the historical thing up there and explain what it meant. What do you feel as the value, the way you use story in the relationship to art? Could you talk about that? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously raise a really important point, which is, how does narrative, in effect, engage us? And how does it, in effect, immediately contextualize work of art by situating us in a particular way? And so not only do we follow the life of a particular person, we follow Oscar Schell walking around New York trying to find this, but there's also enigmas posed. What is the sixth message? Who is the right Mr. Black? And all of that, which in effect, make possible as a set of preconditions of why we want to engage the art. And so that, for me, it's one of the things I'm fascinated by, is narrative and the power of narrative. Yes, sir.
Get to the microphone. It seems that most artists internalize a need to create art, and whether money flows from that or not. So a question to Mr. Collins is, we're not really very far removed from 9/11. So did that film make money? And if so, where did the money go? And what are the ethics of making money as a result of that tragedy?
Sure, it's a good question. The film was moderately successful. The novel was very controversial. That it was based on was very controversial, and some people felt that even Jonathan Safran Foer was, in fact, cashing in on national trauma by writing this novel. His response was, as a New Yorker, the only way he was going to be able to continue to live in New York was to be able to come to terms with that. And that isn't something that was necessarily universally applauded. I mean, it was something that some readers and some critics thought it was a masterpiece, and it was therapeutic for an entire city, and that it should be used in the same way around here. We have one Michiana, one book, one Michiana, and a kind of community, reads a book together. I just took part in this past spring, and they've used To Kill a Mockingbird in the past, and The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, and it's been suggested that, for New York, a book like Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close would be a very good choice to help the community, live through that and work through certain kinds of issues. The film, though, did not do as well as people had hoped. Simply because I think there's a real resistance to thinking about that, about 9/11. The sense that I myself, I'm the first one to admit that I avoided reading the novel, and because at first I didn't think it was really much. Did I really want to go through that again? And it seems to me that you always have to weigh things like who's going to be benefiting from this. But there are different kinds of benefits. There's the financial benefit, and then there's also a cathartic kind of benefit by going through that, especially for people. When I've taught it before, some of my students are from New York, and it's still a searing experience for them. But then I have students from all over the country who saw it only on the news, and in effect resisted discussing it and even reading it. And then the further we got into it and the more we talked about it, saw it as a very positive experience, because in effect it turned them from being bystanders into witnesses.
Another question?
Yes, sir.
You're all a bit younger than a lot of us in the audience, and obviously I was certainly thinking about, you're teaching the younger generation. And so how does each one of you touch in some way on technology, some way interfacing with your work? How does your teaching change, or what's in the minds of students who are so technologically in touch, from research to doing their own, tweets and all the rest? Because does that change in any way the basic way you go about teaching?
I can answer that in part. One thing that I do with my students is try to encourage them to think beyond the paper, right? I mean, there's, in college, where our traditional form of evaluation is having students write a term paper and then grading it, right? And I think there are ways of bringing technology into that process. I've had my students create media campaigns in groups as part of their final project. They'll pick a social problem they find really interesting and that they want to make a change in society about, and then work together to make a media campaign on campus that gets people to try to change their opinions, and then they have to evaluate it themselves. They have to kind of find measures of whether that campaign actually had an impact on the way people make sense of that issue. So that's just one way I've brought it into the classroom. I also use movies, just like Jim has suggested, and other kinds of things to kind of bring them into using those skills they already have.
I'll talk about that too. I teach painting and drawing, so I always joke with my students when I say, welcome to Painting 1. We're going to be using the same technologies that cave people did, basically. And that's really what we do. We mix pigment with oil and apply it by hand to a surface. But the way they make their images is embedded in a different culture than cave people, had. They're so immersed in technology. They know the world through the computer, a lot of them. The way they have access to ideas, a lot of ideas, and a lot of artists is by looking online. So it essentially becomes a really different kind of experience because although it is a traditional form, it's embedded within a radically different culture.
Yeah, I'd like to say a little about that as well. I typically try to get students that I work with, and actually faculty that I work with as well, to try to get away from the technology. And I don't mean get away from it by not using it. I mean, don't let the technology tell you what you have. Like I was saying earlier when I was showing my images, it's a series of numbers, and I have chosen to represent those numbers in ways that are useful to me. I often work with biologists who will work with imagery that they've taken through microscopes, and they'll say, this is the picture, or this is the image. This is a series of numbers that you selected to represent in a certain way. And one of the things that I've learned how to do as part of my work in the DVT is take those numbers, and I can take that image and I can turn it into something three-dimensional in order to represent it in that way. Or I can even turn it into a movie to show layers of focus or anything. And I really try to get people to move away from thinking it's a picture, it has to stay a picture, it'll always be a picture. No, it's a series of numbers, and once you've got those numbers in a computer, you can do whatever you want to them as long as it's useful and hopefully it's useful and valuable.
It's a really important question because this new media technologies are changing not only how art is being produced, but also the circumstances of how you consume it. I just finished a course this past spring on portable media devices. And we talked about how it is that, in effect, if you got a device that allows you on the same screen to read a Virginia Woolf novel, to watch Mad Men, to play Angry Birds, to go to the internet, all on that same screen, and that device you hold in your hand is a playback screen. It's also a personal library, your archive, as well as a portal through the internet. And if that's the case, how does that change the circumstances of how we read, how we watch, and what we do that for?
It's an art-making machine too, right? I mean, you can take video and take photos and edit things on your phones, and kids are using that to make short films for YouTube and that kind of thing. So, some of the things I was talking about art making, I think there is just as important a tool.
Well, it also begs the question, as far as technology is concerned, is there a concern about new ways in making art will replace what you were talking about before, the ballet, the opera, or is there a way in which both of those can coexist? I would imagine they would both coexist, but when you look at art history, there have been mediums that have in essence almost gone completely extinct just based on what people would either consider evolution or change.
I mean, what I would say to that is, yes. I mean, I think as long as there's an audience willing to support a particular kind of art, they'll still exist, I think. But I think that's exactly right, though. If you look at culture and art as a robust system rather than a fragile one, right, some arts go away, and they go away when they're not as useful to society anymore. And there's a lot of defensive work trying to protect some arts that might be on the decline. As long as there's an audience, I think we should try to keep them. I think there's value to all these different kinds of arts, but I think you're right. There's an evolutionary process going on across the broader field.
I just want to pick up on, because Jim said technology changes not only how art is made, but how it's experienced. So when you consider that for most of history, for the vast majority of history, you had to go somewhere to see a work of art. So if you wanted to see, let's say, Chartres Cathedral or something, you had to make a pilgrimage there. You had to actually go there and go through that experience. It kind of prepared you in a way for this experience, and it was an actual physical kind of journey, and you exist in space and you see this thing. Where now, you can just go online and see. We have access to all kinds of art from all over the world, and so the way you experience it is not spatially. I mean, I know I was really surprised the first time I went to Europe and saw a lot of the paintings that I saw in school, I was shocked. Like, this, I had no sense of scale. I mean, you can read how big and how small they are, but when you're in front of a painting that's 15 feet long, it's a really different experience than seeing it, 3 inches wide in a book or on a screen. So, but that's changed the way art is, it's like this dynamic now.
It's interesting because I think there's a social element now that is also missing from art when you're talking about seeing in a solitary place at a computer or on your own, as opposed to going to a museum or seeing a theatrical experience. Not only is there what's being created on stage, but there's that dynamic that goes on with the audience as well that I think is part and parcel of that. I'm sorry.
No problem. I'm interested in painting. I studied here with Doug Kinsey. And so you know that my canvases were very brushstroke. So I'm interested in hearing more. You talked about leaving all of that out. You talked about the way that you're doing that. I'm interested in having you talk a little bit further of that, because one of the things we found, and I too have an MFA and continue to paint, but one of the things that we've done in order to keep it more of a maybe it's just a generational thing, is that we've kept quite a bit more happening on the surface. So it's, besides being the image itself, it's the surface also is still active. And so and even the images that we looked at, some reminded me of Motherwell, some of the science images. Even those paintings had quite a bit of brushstroke to them. Right. And so I'm interested why you chose to go that way.
Well, I might just start out answering that question by talking about, a lot of people generally understand art as being timeless. A lot of people talk about art in that way, that it's timeless. And I would challenge people on that. I think it's the opposite. I think it's timely. Something that's timeless there's a quality that it occurs in some place over there that's apart from historical conditions, and art isn't made in that other place. It can only be made by people, and people are affected and are shaped by their historical conditions. So there are lots of paintings, particularly in mid 20th century, where there was an immense amount of focus given to the physical qualities of the paint. When you look back in that era and you see, for example, look at the books, the sociology books that were being written at that time. There was a real fear and an intense focus on how culture had changed and how people were becoming a company man, a conventional person, subsumed by the machinery of government and other institutions. So there was a kind of reaction to that. Artists, a lot of people wanted to kind of assert their individuality and to say, I exist, I think for myself and so on. I don't want to be part of that kind of machinery, that mechanism. And so they focused on brush mark, on the physicality of the paint, on leaving a kind of trace of their physical presence in front of the canvas. So a lot of that abstract art, while it doesn't have an image, you do, when you look at it, you do have the sense of the artist's physical presence there, and the kind of big, insistent gestural marks that kind of proclaim, in a way, I am here, exist as an individual, an autonomous individual. But that kind of painting does have a long history, and we read it as emotional. We read it as very emotive. You can go back in history all the way to like Halls and painters like that, where you do feel the presence of the artist there. What I do is really different from that. I come out of very different historical circumstances, and I wanted to make images that both talked about my sense of having been shaped by forces outside of myself, while simultaneously trying to focus on the sensation, the persistent sensation of singularity. I tried to find a formal way to marry those two very different sensibilities. And the way I came up with was basically to turn myself into a machine or a robot or a process that appears not to have agency, while at the same time making an image that's centered on emotions. That's why I do it the way I do.
We have time for maybe one or two more questions. We have just a few more minutes. So,
why isn't there more of an emphasis on showing just the benefit of the training and learning how to do art in your regular job? Like I went to a school of engineering, right? When I went to school, it was right when they stopped learning. You had to go and do. They stopped teaching drafting because the computers replaced it. And so I mean, and I can see this in my regular engineering job. It's having that skill of knowing how to take pencil to paper and do, it was, engineering, it's still, there's still some artistic thing, and you feel limited in how, because you need all this machinery in order to translate your ideas to other people, because you got to go through a CAD program and all that, and now you kind of lose that, and it's just like, so even in engineering, I could see where just having some sort of, art training would have, would allow me to convey ideas. I don't see that, shown to people that you need this. Art would benefit anything, because you can show these ideas more.
I think it's a great question. I mean, I have some colleagues that are doing work on double majors, so in universities, and their effects on creativity. And what they find is that double majors, they assume that double majors in general, just having two disciplines and having them speak to each other, would increase creativity. They found that it works if you have a hard science major with like a humanities major, then you get a spike in creativity. But if you don't, and you just have two hard science majors, they have relatively low creativity. And so I think it speaks to exactly what you're saying, that engaging in art has these spillover effects into other disciplines when you're able to kind of marry them. Yeah.
You might be happy to know, too, that drawing has enjoyed this huge resurgence of interest. I can't remember, but when I was in school, there weren't that many drawing shows, or not that much interest in it, but there is now. So that kind of handmade quality in drawings it's really pretty valued. I'm also a part of a department that has industrial and graphic design in it, and a lot of that work is focused on a computer, but I know all my colleagues absolutely stress the value of drawing.
I think I'd also like to say something about your point. I think it's really interesting to think about how learning to create art changes your options for communication, and means that you have a better way to try to get that to someone else. But also, one of the things that I didn't get the chance to talk much about was how art kind of teaches us how to see in a way. I was having dinner with an artist at one point. We were discussing some of these issues, and she said, we were at one of those restaurants where you have paper that you can draw on the, and so she said, draw my face, and she gave me a pencil. And so I drew a face, and she said, okay, now look at me and draw my face. And the ears were in a completely different place. The shape of the jawline was completely different when I actually focused on what was in front of me and drew it. And I think that teaching us how to see is a super valuable part of artwork that you lose if you don't take the time to learn how to draw when you're learning engineering as well. And I think that's a really interesting point.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to once again thank our panelists for this very lively discussion.